It began, as so many revolutions do, with an image. A grainy black and white photograph passed from a satellite feed to an analyst's desk at the Pentagon, early 1961. A runway somewhere outside Kyiv, snow on the edges, and in the center, something silver, something sleek, something that wasn't supposed to exist. No insignia, no serial number, just a shape, sharper, smoother, stranger than anything the West had built. For days, the photograph moved through channels: Air Force intelligence, CIA, defense analysis. Each department asked the same question: whose jet is that? And each one received the same answer: we don't know. The jet was real. Its creator was not. Officially, there was no record of an engineer named Oleh Kasyanov, no commendations, no personnel files, just a signature on an old requisition form buried in Antonov's archives. Oleh, Lab 153. He had existed in the cracks of a system that did not believe in individuals. In the Soviet Union, brilliance was collective, and collectives do not remember their shadows. Kasyanov was one of thousands of engineers working behind locked doors and lead-painted windows. He didn't command divisions or draft manifestos. He drew curves. He tested airflow. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that perfection could survive politics. The 1950s USSR was a contradiction forged in iron, a superpower wrapped in silence. It feared its thinkers as much as it celebrated them. Innovation lived behind padlocks. Failure died without funerals. Every city had its factory. Every factory had its bureau. And every bureau had its ghosts, teams that existed only on paper, absorbing discarded ideas the official system couldn't afford to admit. Kyiv was one such ghost city, a capital of quiet genius. Its design bureau, OKB 153, was officially tasked with transport aircraft. Unofficially, it housed curiosity. And curiosity in the USSR was dangerous. Deep inside a warren of concrete corridors, a handful of engineers began working after hours, a self-appointed laboratory of the unwanted. They used discarded instruments, scrap aluminum, and equations scribbled on ration paper. Their leader was Kasyanov, 40 years old, polite, unremarkable, the kind of man the party forgot to promote because he never asked. His obsession was simple: air that did not fight the aircraft. He had found a German technical report from 1944 titled Verschmelzung von Rumpf und Flügel, the merging of fuselage and wing. It described a blended body, a shape that allowed air to flow as one continuous surface. The idea had been left to rot with the Reich. Kasyanov saw resurrection. For weeks he worked alone, sketching by the glow of a stolen desk lamp, where traditional planes sliced the sky. His design would glide through it. He calculated lift distribution, center of pressure migration, boundary layer stability. He ran the numbers by hand. The numbers mocked him. He ran them again. They fell silent. The solution was beautiful and impossible. A fuselage so perfectly curved that drag would collapse by half. At Mach 2, it would need no afterburner. At subsonic speeds, it would fly like silk, a machine that didn't roar. It would breathe. He named it, privately, Sokol II, the Falcon. When he presented the concept to his superior, the man blinked once and said, "This is not Soviet design. It looks Western." It was the worst accusation imaginable. Western meant ideologically contaminated. Western meant treason in aluminum. Funding was denied. Kasyanov was warned. He smiled, nodded, and went back to work after midnight. He built his own tools from broken machine parts, paid helpers in vodka and tobacco, bartered fuel from a neighboring motor pool. Piece by piece, night by night, the Falcon took shape under tarps that smelled of oil and fear. It was not an official project. It was an act of faith. By 1960, the prototype stood on 3 borrowed landing gears, a fuselage that blended into its wings like water into ice, intakes shaped like gills, a cockpit so narrow that it seemed grown rather than built. It was not painted red or gray like other Soviet aircraft. It was bare metal, polished until the sky itself looked back. Rumors spread through Kyiv of a ghost plane that could outrun its shadow. The Bureau laughed, because rumors are safe until they take off. February 1961, runway 23, Gostomel Airfield, minus 12 degrees. A thin mist hung above the asphalt like breath, waiting to be released. The pilot, Captain Belov, zipped his leather suit and grinned. If it explodes, at least we'll die before the paperwork. Engines ignited. The Falcon rolled forward. No scream, no tremor, just motion. At 200 kilometers per hour, it rose as if weight were a misunderstanding. The radio crackled. Mach 0.8, 0.9, 1.5. Silence. 2.1. Still stable. Kasyanov closed his eyes. For a moment the world was smaller than a heartbeat, and his machine was free. When the Falcon landed, the runway fell silent. No applause, no cheering. Just the slow, disbelieving sound of cooling metal. The flight data was impossible. Mach 2.1 at reduced thrust, stable across the transonic barrier. No structural flutter. No compressor stall. In an era when every Soviet jet fought the air like an adversary, the Falcon had made peace with it. Belov stepped from the cockpit, frost clinging to his visor. He said only, "It doesn't fly. It glides." Kasyanov said nothing. He didn't trust words anymore. He trusted numbers, and the numbers had crossed a threshold that even he didn't fully understand. The report went to Moscow, wrapped in secrecy and suspicion. It reached the Ministry of Aviation on a gray morning in March. Within hours, a team of bureaucrats arrived at Kyiv to review the data. They didn't ask questions, they asked for control. The lead official, an older engineer turned administrator, flipped through the documents and frowned. "Comrade Kasyanov," he said, "you have invented something we did not ask for. In the Soviet Union, that was not praise. It was a warning." He accused the team of falsifying results. He demanded a second test under full supervision using new instruments. It was conducted 3 days later. The readings were identical. The officials stopped doubting the numbers. They started fearing them. The problem wasn't that the Falcon failed. It was that it succeeded without permission. If a small unregistered group in Kyiv could outpace every official design bureau in Moscow and Novosibirsk, what did that say about the system that claimed to control genius? The higher the Falcon flew, the more dangerous it became, not to enemies, but to egos. So the order came down quietly, project terminated. Prototype confiscated, report sealed, no explanation, no signature, just a single stamped phrase for further analysis, which in Soviet code meant buried. One night trucks rolled into the hangar. The Falcon was dismantled by men who didn't know what they were touching. Wings cut with saws. Panels numbered and packed into crates labeled experimental scrap. Kasyanov watched from a distance. He was not allowed to enter his own laboratory. The next day he received a reassignment notice. Agricultural Aviation Development Division, Kharkiv. It was exile in plain sight. He packed his notebooks into a leather satchel, left his badge on the desk, and walked out without looking back. No one at the bureau spoke his name again. But ghosts don't vanish easily. In June 1961, American reconnaissance satellites recorded a strange heat signature at a Kyiv airfield, too small for a bomber, too hot for a transport. A photograph followed, a silver delta shape gleaming against the snow. The CIA analysts were confused. No Soviet project matched the profile. The air intakes were unusual, slanted, organic, almost biological, and the proportions didn't fit any Midge or Sukhoi design. The report's conclusion was brief. Unknown prototype. Advanced blended configuration. Potential stealth characteristics. They called it Project Silver Bird. In Washington, generals pored over the image like archaeologists examining an alien relic. If the Soviets had mastered low-drag blended bodies, the entire balance of aerial warfare could shift. Meetings followed meetings. Budgets expanded overnight. Lockheed and Northrop received emergency funding for counter-designs. The Air Force wanted to know how the Soviets had done it. The CIA wanted to know who. Neither ever found an answer, because even in Moscow, no one was willing to admit the Falcon existed. It was as if the machine had been erased from reality, its creator, its test, its purpose, all dissolved into bureaucratic silence. For 2 years, Western intelligence continued to reference the mysterious aircraft. Every unknown radar return, every anomalous photograph was labeled possible silver bird activity. It became legend, a phantom jet that haunted both sides of the Cold War. And through it all, Kasyanov remained in Kyiv, designing crop dusters with the precision of a man who once reached Mach 2. He said nothing. He built nothing that flew high again. But sometimes, when he walked home past the factory's empty yard, he would look up and imagine the falcon still flying above the clouds, unseen, unacknowledged, but free. History likes to bury its contradictions, but sometimes the earth refuses to hold them. The so-called two had vanished from official records, but fragments of it, both metal and memory, continued to surface in the unlikeliest of places. At a repair depot outside Minsk, a technician discovered a wing panel made of an unfamiliar alloy that resisted corrosion and weighed half of standard steel. In Novosibirsk, a graduate student stumbled on fluid dynamics data that didn't match any known airframe. And in a Kyiv warehouse, a crate labeled obsolete components contained an instrument panel carved from a single block of aluminum. So light it seemed hollow, so advanced it looked modern, 30 years too soon. Piece by piece, the Falcon was reassembling itself in rumor. In the mid-1970s, an American intelligence officer stationed in Berlin came across a folder in a defected bureaucrat's briefcase. It was marked only with the letters S2 K153. Inside were rough sketches, hand-drawn, annotated in pencil, with equations in Cyrillic margin notes. The shape looked eerily familiar, a wide blended body tapering into razor wings, twin inlets at the base, and a tail that melted into the fuselage. Didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the same philosophy that would one day define the stealth jet. The report circulated quietly through Langley, then across the desks of designers at Northrop and Boeing. It was labeled possibly disinformation, but one engineer reportedly stared at it for a long time and said, "If this is fake, it's a brilliant fake. If it's real, we're late." Years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a group of Western researchers gained limited access to Antonov's archives. Among the dust-coated blueprints and faded memos, they found a box simply titled Aerodynamic Experiments, 1959-61. Inside, hand-drawn airflow maps, marked diagrams plotted in fading blue ink, and one page with a note scrawled in Ukrainian cursive. "The air prefers elegance." It was signed with 2 letters, OK. The papers were mathematical poetry, an intuitive grasp of blended flow, laminar transition, and distributed lift decades ahead of what the West had published. One American researcher, an aerodynamicist from NASA, later said in an interview, those equations predicted the F-16's behavior 10 years before the F-16 existed. Whoever wrote them wasn't following history. He was rewriting it. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, those who had known Kasyanov grew old in quiet dignity. They spoke of him rarely, as if naming him might draw unwanted attention even long after the fear had faded. But sometimes, over tea or vodka, someone would tell the story of the night he drew the Falcon, a single curve on a blank page that refused to obey geometry. They would talk about the sound the jet made when it took off. Not a roar, but a low hum, like the world taking a deep breath. One engineer swore that during the final test, a flock of birds lifted from the airfield and followed the plane into the sky, as though they recognized kin. By the 1980s, American design bureaus began chasing the same dream, an aircraft that didn't fight the air, but became part of it. Northrop's engineers used supercomputers to test shapes nearly identical to what Kasyanov had drawn with a slide rule. They gave them names: Tacit Blue, YF-23, B-2 Spirit. Their surfaces blended fuselage and wing, their engines buried deep inside, their intention invisibility through smoothness. The Pentagon thought it had invented the future, but the future had already existed for one brief winter in Kyiv, and then been erased. Progress, it seemed, had a longer memory than governments. In 1994, a Western journalist touring the Antonov plant noticed an old photograph on a wall, nearly hidden behind newer displays. It showed a group of engineers standing beside a silver prototype, its wingtips covered in frost. He asked what it was. The guide smiled awkwardly and said, "Ah, that one. A project that never happened." The journalist took a photo of the photo. When he published it in an aviation magazine, historians recognized the shape immediately, the same aircraft that had once panicked the Pentagon. The Silver Bird had returned from myth to memory. By then, Kasyanov was gone, dead for 15 years, buried quietly outside Kyiv, his grave unmarked except for a single bolt of polished aluminum. No one knew who placed it there. But in the margins of the rediscovered notes, under one of his diagrams, was a final sentence written in his precise, deliberate script. "The sky rewards those who listen." That was all. No claim of genius, no plea for recognition, just the belief that air itself had secrets worth hearing. By the time the world learned of the Sokol II, it was too late to celebrate it and too early to understand what it had meant. The jet was gone. The files were scattered. The man who built it was dust, but the idea, the shape endured, hidden in blueprints, memories, and rumor. It was as if the Falcon had never landed at all, as if it had simply kept flying, unseen, through generations of engineers who all dreamed the same dream without realizing whose shadow they were standing in. Progress had taken its course, and like the jet itself, it no longer belonged to anyone. In 2004, a group of young Ukrainian engineers at the Kyiv Polytechnic Institute began restoring an old Antonov test hangar. They were cleaning out rusted fuel drums and cracked drafting tables when one of them found a steel drawer sealed with wax. Inside, a stack of photographs, a few pages of hand-drawn airflow diagrams, and a small metal tag engraved with 2 words, Sokol II, 1961. The paper was fragile. The ink faded to a soft brown, but the math was unmistakable. Drag coefficients that predicted supercruise. Stability curves matched almost perfectly to modern stealth profiles. One student whispered, "This looks like the B-2. Another answered, "No, this came before it." The discovery made no headlines, but among aerodynamicists, it spread like static through a quiet room, a name revived from rumor, a ghost confirmed in ink. When declassified Western reports resurfaced in the late 2000s, one former CIA analyst described the Silver Bird panic as the most productive case of paranoia in U.S. history. Because in trying to catch a phantom, America had accidentally accelerated its own evolution. Projects like Have Blue, Tacit Blue, and Senior Ice, the classified precursors to stealth technology, were funded partly out of fear that the Soviets had already cracked the code. They hadn't, not officially. But one man in Kyiv almost had. History, it turns out, doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it spirals, revisiting ideas that were abandoned too early, too beautiful, too inconvenient for their time. Aerodynamics is not politics. It is truth spoken in curves and pressure gradients. It does not bend to borders or propaganda. The same equations that guided Lockheed's black projects were already sleeping in Kasyanov's notebooks. The same elegant ratios that defined the stealth bomber's wing-to-fuselage transition had been drawn on graph paper by a man who had to hide his pencil. He didn't have supercomputers. He had intuition and the courage to trust it. Every time air flowed across one of his sketches, it whispered back the same message: perfection has no ideology. Today, in the Kyiv State Aviation Museum, among the towering Antonov transports and weathered MiG fighters, there's a quiet corner of display glass. Inside it, a single photograph, a silver jet, snow glinting on its wings, a falcon painted near the nose. There is no placard, no mention of its maker, no acknowledgement that it ever flew. Visitors walk past it without stopping, but sometimes an engineer will pause, tilt their head and smile, the way one might at a familiar melody heard through static, because they know. Because every aircraft designer knows the feeling of chasing the impossible and the fear of building something too far ahead of permission. Oleh Kasyanov died without knowing what he had started. No medals, no state funeral, no monument. Just a handful of peers who understood that he had touched something eternal. One of them, an aging test pilot who had flown the Falcon that day in 1961, visited his grave years later. He placed a single feather beside the small bolt of polished aluminum that marked the spot. He whispered, "You were right, Oleg. The air remembers." And for a moment the wind through the pines sounded almost like the rush of jet engines at takeoff. History is full of men who built empires, and fewer who built beauty. Kasyanov was one of the latter, a craftsman who believed that truth could be engineered, and that elegance was not a luxury but a law of nature. He was forgotten by the state, ignored by his superiors, and buried without honors. But his equations survived. His ideas escaped, and his machine, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, still flies today in every jet that learns to hide from its own shadow. Progress is not a straight line. It is a series of rediscoveries, each one paid for in silence. The Falcon proved that innovation doesn't come from power, or politics, or even resources, but from defiance. One man, one desk, one idea can outpace entire nations, but the reward is rarely fame, it's endurance. To know that even when the world forgets, the laws of physics do not, because air remembers, and memory, like flight, cannot be contained forever. The sky never cared for borders. It only keeps score of who learned from it. Oleh Kasyanov listened. He built not for glory, but for understanding. And for one cold morning in 1961, he succeeded perfectly, quietly, completely. The jet rose, the Falcon flew, and somewhere in the sound of its passing, the future took a breath.